because we've still got a few people that are going to be joining us. Okay, good morning, everybody. Welcome to UCAS's webinar on risk-based approach to assessments. Before we get underway, I'll just do some details of how this session will run and some introductions. So firstly, I'm Jeff Ruddle. I'm UCAS's Strategic Development Director. I've got responsibility for a number of activities in UCAS, including projects that we're looking to do to improve the service that we provide, the approach that we take to assessing and conducting our services within here. And one of these projects is this risk-based approach to assessment, and I'll be running through that shortly with you. The presentation I'm going to provide is going to take around to do, and then we will take questions at the end. Also with me on the panelists for this webinar, I've got Sam Giles, who is the section head for our construction team. So Sam will help me if any of the sort of questions particularly sort of come into the operational arena. And I've also got Yasmin Daldas, who is the project manager for this particular project on here as well. But hopefully Yasmin will put the questions to me at the end, but hopefully I should be able to, through the presentation, the Q&A, cover most things that come up here. Talking about the Q&A, hopefully most people are familiar with this now, but you will have a Q&A area on the toolbar for Zoom. So if you do have any questions as we run through, please put them into there, and then we will address them at the end of the presentation. Also worth mentioning that we are recording this session. We're doing that so that we can share a copy of this presentation with all customers in the construction testing sector afterwards, and that will mean that that you're also sent a copy of the recording. It'll probably take about sort of a week for us to get that and the other information out to you following on from this presentation. Here. Okay. So to get underway, let me just sort of say what we're aiming to do with this session, what we're aiming to get across in here. So we want to communicate to you, the what and the why of the risk-based approach. What is it that UCAS is doing? Why is it that we're talking to the construction testing sector today, and what it might well mean for you in terms of a pilot program that we will be looking to start within the sector soon. I'd obviously give that all important opportunity for Q&A as we go through here, so we can get those questions and answer them directly for you during this webinar. So a little bit of a background to talk about the project, where it's come from, how it got initiated, and things in there. So the first thing I want to say is risk-based approach to assessment. UCAS currently does have a risk-based approach to our assessment. So it's not as though we don't have anything at all, but that risk-based approach at the moment is limited to the assessment manager being able to look at the frequency that certain activities are assessed over the course of the 4-year cycle. But they are tied into doing an annual assessment of our customers and having to cover certain things on an annual basis and things on those kind of lines. So there is some restrictions on them and a little bit of freedom for them to have some risk-based approach within there. But one of the things we wanted to do is we wanted to have a bit more of a look at what we could do with a risk-based approach in there. When 17011 was revised a few years back, now it did put much more emphasis on having a risk-based approach, and also opened up a lot more possibilities around things such as remote assessment, which obviously we've been using quite heavily over the last 18 months or so as a result of the pandemic. But looking at that revision and also looking at feedback that was coming in from customers and stakeholders and coming out of some of our internal reviews, we wanted to look at how we could perhaps widen out the options on a risk-based approach, particularly looking at the frequency that assessments were performed of customers in there. Because what we were seeing in some cases, perhaps that particularly where a customer did not have an extensive scope of accreditation, that we were often seeing the same things on a yearly basis, seeing the same people on a yearly basis, and where that customer was performing well, that didn't necessarily seem the right use of resources. And at the other end of the scale, we did have customers that were perhaps going through challenging times or doing exceptionally complex work that maybe we felt we weren't putting enough focus onto that activity to make sure we're giving the right level of confidence to the clients of our customers and to the stakeholders that are interested in there. So we wanted to make sure that we kind of got the focus of our resources on the right areas of risk. That formed itself into a strategic objective, which then formed itself into this project that we sort of really started in earnest in the start of 2020. So whilst that project was initiated in 2020, we did do a few things beforehand in there as well. We went and had a bit of a look about how other accreditation bodies approach this, what they do for their risk-based approaches. We also had a look at what several regulators did for risk-based approach for their inspections, looking at regulators such as the Health and Safety Executive and the Medicines and Healthcare Regulatory Agency, and considering the approaches they took. So we did a bit of sort of research and sort of benchmarking before we kind of came in and initiated our own project. And then when we initiated our own project, we've done a lot of consultation with our technical and policy advisory committees, with our own internal resources, that's the assessment managers, and we've had some overall governance from the UCAS directors on this as well, because it could mark quite a significant change in the way that UCAS approaches our assessment. And during the course of 2020, we spent a lot of time with a couple of sections within UCAS, within our asbestos and our medical laboratory sections, developing approaches to evaluate the risks that customers present to UCAS within there. And then in 2021, we moved on to piloting that approach within our asbestos sector. So that has been underway since about February this year. That pilot is going well so far, and off the back of that, we have decided to extend that pilot out further into some more sectors. And one of those sectors that we are looking at is the construction testing sector, so the area that you work in. Few things to sort of note about the risk-based approach, and I think to get on here to talk about up front and just take you through what we're sort of looking at and what we mean when we talk about some of the things in here, because risk is something that's a little bit subjective. What one person considers to be low risk is not what another person considers to be low risk, and the same with high risk as well. And so that is something when we've looked at this approach, we've had to consider how do we make sure we get consistent approach from our teams when they're looking at the risk in here. And firstly, this is the risk that the organisation, the conformity assessment body, presents to UCAS. And what we're doing here is looking at indicators of how well that organisation is operating, from historic performance, from current issues, what challenges it's got going on at the moment, but also considering the impact that if something went wrong, what impact that would have on there. How directly related is the work that people are doing to things such as human health, personal liberty, things along those kind of lines. What's the direct impact of something going wrong within the cab and the work that they're accredited for in there. So the evaluation that we perform, and I'll go into that in a little bit more detail at the moment, helps our teams get some consistent guidance about whether a cab is more or less likely to present risk. But there's some important things to say in here. Firstly, lower risk doesn't mean no risk. Organisations come to UCAS because there's a need for assurance around the work that they do. That means there is some level of risk within there. So lower end of it does not mean no risk, it just perhaps means lower than the norm within the sector. And it's the same thing again, higher risk does not mean unacceptable risk. If the risk that the organisation presents is unacceptable, then that organisation should not be accredited within there. The higher end of the risk scale represents an organisation that is having some performance issues, is having some, maybe going through some challenging times with a lot of change on the organisation, and therefore at that time it presents more risk. And what we feel is that outcome will enable us to be proactive in what we're doing to ensure that we get consistent outcomes to our assessment. Because the key thing on here is that what we're doing guides us in taking the approach that we need to do to give confidence to the clients and to the stakeholders of our customers. The confidence associated with a customer that comes out at the lower end of the risk scale is exactly the same as that at the higher end of the risk scale. It's just that UCAS needs a slightly different approach to give that same level of confidence. So there's absolutely no variation in the confidence that is provided, only the approach that UCAS uses to provide that confidence within there. As I was just sort of reiterate here, the outcome is guidance, very much so on there. This is not going to be an automated thing that tells the assessment teams that they have to spend 5 days with the customer and 2 of those days are going to be remote. It is something that guides them into what is an appropriate approach for the customer, given the risk profile that they appear to have. Some principles that we took in place when we were looking to build this risk evaluation that we do. We wanted it to be relatively quick to conduct when the people have got the data with them in here. What we didn't want to do is potentially make some efficiency savings, some savings in the time that we're spending in one area to completely lose those in another area because we are spending hours and upon hours doing an extensive risk evaluation. So we've tried to focus it on information that can be reasonably quickly evaluated within there and also doesn't need to be very, very precisely evaluated. So it makes it quite easy and quick to conduct. We wanted the data to come from several sources. So we didn't want it all just coming from one part of UCAS or all coming from the customer. So the data that's in there predominantly comes from 3 main sources, which is UCAS records, looking at the sort of history of the organization, the assessment team, so what is happening with the organization at that time, and then there's some self-declared information from the customer as well. So there's mainly 3 separate sources of information. Most of the criteria is objective within there. I think the couple that aren't are based upon the professional judgments of the assessment team, which is based upon the objective criteria they look at the assessment. So it's based upon objective criteria within there, but it is a professional judgment on those. We wanted to manage differing sector risk profiles in there, because what may be appropriate for one particular sector of work that we do in terms of frequency and approach to assessment may not be appropriate to another sector in there where there's perhaps more impact happening on the outcome of the work that they do. Definitely wanted the outcome to be guidance, as already mentioned, and we wanted this to be a periodic review as well. We didn't want to an organisation to be stuck in a certain risk category for their whole 4-year cycle without that being re-looked at to see if their risk rating has increased or decreased over time. So it will be something that's revisited with every assessment activity, well, every sort of surveillance or reassessment activity. Now, the risk indicators, now I'm not going to go through all of the risk indicators and present them individually to you. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One is that we don't want to sort of share the full information because we don't want people to be gaming the system. And I mentioned earlier that the data is, the risk evaluation is meant to be quick to conduct. And for that reason, there are some things that are risk indicators that, because it's quite hard to obtain the data, will take quite a lot of lengthy time within there, we've decided not to include them in there. Or there's some things where there's the particular breakpoints on there. We don't want people just focusing on looking at 1 or 2 particular points rather than the whole standard and the whole thing that they should be associated with. But generally, the risks fall into these sort of 5 main groups. There's the risks coming about as a result of uncertainty. So factors such as organisational change, changes in key members of staff, opening up new facilities, going for a merger and acquisition. There are factors related to the complexity of the work that's done, so doing work in overseas locations, having a large scale of operations, lots of multiple sites, all of those things add complexity to the organisation. The historic performance, how have issues such as complaints, have we had complaints about that organisation that have been upheld? Have there been repeat non-conformities found at the organisation? Look at external factors, have regulators that are relevant for that area taken regulatory action against that organisation? And then what are the risks for the sector? What are the implications should things go wrong within there? So those are the sort of 5 broad categories of where the risk indicators sit. that's a bit of a rough overview in there. It's worth, before I sort of come on to talk about the pilot program, just mentioning quickly how that evaluation process will be done. So the evaluation process starts when the assessment team start planning for their assessment. So they would look at the historic information at that point in there. And then it carries through into the conduct of the assessment, where some of the outcomes of things they're looking at during the assessment would go into that risk evaluation, and the customer would be asked to sort of self-declare some information which would also go into there. These are not new things. All of the things that we are looking at bringing into here are stuff that we consider already during our assessments on there. So they won't be new questions or new things that you're being asked for, but we will perhaps be just sort of asking for them in a slightly different way to what we have done before, so we can put that answer into the evaluation matrix. Some of the questions will ask you for maybe what is the approximate percentage of your staff turnover, and it is very much an approximate. We don't expect you to have to sort of, unless you have that data directly to hand, then I know some organizations do, but if you don't, don't expect you to go off and spend loads of time calculating that. Let us know roughly what it is. The matrix is designed such that it's tolerant of sort of estimated answers within there. So don't feel the need for super accuracy on some of the answers that you're providing. So in terms of the pilot program, there's two main phases to the pilot program that we're working on. The first one is what we're terming the data collection phase. This is where we'll be conducting the evaluations alongside your assessment, and looking to use the outcome of that to help us model what the impact of this will be in terms of the resourcing needs for UCAS in the future, and how that we make sure that we can appropriately plan the assessments in there. Because if we are changing the frequency potentially of assessments, that could impact our sort of resource management into there. So currently that data collection phase is ongoing for the asbestos sector, and we aim to start that for the construction sector from the start of August this year. Implementing the actual changes to the frequency of assessment in there, and the approach to assessment will be from the start of next financial year, so from April 2022, 2023 onwards. For the case of the construction sector, because we're starting you partway through this financial year, it's unlikely to be right from the start of next financial year. It's probably more likely to be in the second half of next financial year, so sort of September, October 2022 onwards. There are, in a lot more detail than I'm going to go into in this webinar, there are some terms of reference that will be sent to you alongside the recording of this webinar in here, which outline the specifics of the pilot program. What the sort of expectations are, what changes does it mean around our process, all those kind of things are contained within that terms of reference. What you can expect from UCAS, and also what we're going to expect from yourselves as a customer in terms of sort of giving us and the information and providing that so we can perform the risk evaluation. It also covers the fact that this is a pilot program. Part of doing this is to review the feasibility of this activity. A lot of work has gone into this already, so you wouldn't be going ahead with this pilot program if we weren't pretty sure that this was going to work. And obviously a potential outcome of the pilot program is that we decide that this isn't feasible, it can't work, and we do need to kind of go back to what we were doing before. So it does cover that kind of what happens if we decide not to progress as well, is all covered in the terms of reference. The evaluation process itself, a little bit about how it's going to work and how it's going to go through. As I've already mentioned, it is completed and conducted through that assessment process. So this is something that in time you will be communicated the outcome as part of your recommendation. That's not going to happen to start with. And the reason we're not doing that right at the start is that we want to make sure that we've got the evaluation matrix right. We don't want to be in a situation where we communicate an outcome to you as a customer and have to come back to you shortly afterwards and say, actually, we've really looked at the way this is working, and the outcome we gave you is wrong, and we've had to readjust it. So we are going to take a few months of looking at that data and how it works before we start communicating outcomes to you. And as I've mentioned, the assessment team may ask you, well, we'll ask you for information to help them complete that. And these will be about things that regularly get looked at as part of your assessment process anyway. Things such as the changes in key staff, changes in operational structures, use of temporary resources, conflicts of interest, things along those kind of lines in there. So the outcome, what could be the possible outcome from here? There's 3 possible outcomes that come through from here. One is that your organization is identified for enhanced monitoring. Enhanced monitoring means that we need to do a bit more than what we're currently doing as an annual assessment to ensure that we look at the activity and give it the right area of focus on the things that are concerning at that time. Whilst we'll not share the full outcome of the risk evaluation with you, if you are identified for enhanced monitoring, you may want to know the things that are creating that elevated result for you. And the assessment team can definitely sort of share the indicators, so let you know what it is that's causing that elevated score, if not exactly the exact sort of results and outcome of that in there, but the areas that are causing that concern on it. So enhanced monitoring, any of you who've had an extra assessment from us in the past, which is a route we often use where we identify something for concern, enhanced monitoring will be pretty similar to that. The team or a subset of the team will come back in between the visit you've just had and your future assessment activities to look at the areas that were causing the concern within there. So it's pretty similar to what our extra assessment process will be at the moment, but putting a bit more consistent structure in there to guide the team about when they need to do those extra assessments. Standard monitoring, that will be exactly what we're doing at the moment. An annual assessment with a blended mix between remote and on-site assessment as appropriate to the organisation within there. Reduced monitoring may mean that we would come to see you less frequently than annually. So that might mean 3 assessments during a 4-year cycle, or possibly for those coming out at the very end of the low end of the risk scale, 1 visit every 2 years. In there. There would be some interim catch-ups between those assessments for those people on reduced monitoring, but that would most likely be a sort of remote session with your assessment manager, maybe 1 or 2 members of the assessment team looking at some key sort of indicators of whether you're maintaining that performance on an ongoing basis within there. I've probably covered those bits on there. It's worth saying actually enhanced monitoring will probably make greater use of on-site assessment within there as well. So we'll make greater use of coming to actually see you to discuss through those issues, those areas of concern within there. Very low end of, if we're coming to see you once every 2 years, you can probably expect that to be an on-site assessment as well. So make sure that we can cover those areas in there, with the interim things being a remote. The standard monitoring will have that balance between sort of remote and on-site assessment in there. One thing to mention, I've already talked about the sort of implementing the outcomes when that's likely to happen from sort of financial year 2022, 2023 onwards. There's likely to be a phased introduction of that as well. Obviously, if we put all of the customers who come out of the lower end of the risk scale, implement their sort of change frequency at the same time, we would get some sort of feast and famine years where we've got a high resource demand in 1 year and a low resource demand in another year. So there's likely to be a phased implementation of that approach, and that will probably be based around when your reassessment is due. If it's identified for enhanced monitoring, that may be implemented slightly earlier. As I mentioned, it's pretty much akin to our extra assessment process at the moment. So that's no real change, just has a slightly different label on it at the moment. One of the things that we want to say from this, and it's coming back to the bit I mentioned earlier, that this approach does not give any more or less confidence on the organisations wherever they come out on the risk evaluation. Someone who was on enhanced monitoring does not have a lower value accreditation than someone who is on reduced monitoring. In their accreditation has equal confidence regardless of the approach that UCAS takes. This risk evaluation is about looking at the process UCAS takes, not about the confidence that is given out to the clients and stakeholders of our customers. And I think just to sort of point out now, if there's any customers that are claiming otherwise, claiming that their accreditation is better, than someone else's because they are on reduced monitoring, then that would actually be against the requirements in the UCAS contract, which are about misrepresentation of accreditation. A few things to note around some process changes that are coming through on here. That enhanced monitoring process essentially replaces extra assessments. They'll probably still be called that in terms of invoicing and quotations and things on those kind of lines, but it's that process will essentially replace that extra assessment part in there. Your status of your monitoring, whether it's enhanced, standard or reduced, doesn't really affect the lead time for booking assessments. So even though the frequency and things may change, we'll still be looking to arrange them earlier in advance as we do at the moment. So you'll still continue to be notified of them upcoming and booking at least 6 weeks, normally a lot further in advance than that, but at least 6 weeks prior to the assessment in there. The other thing that this doesn't change is your overall profile date. So that's when your routine visit would normally be due for an annual assessment, your expiry date of your accreditation, or your reassessment date. So your reassessments will still happen when they are planned to happen within there, and you retain your profile date because if you at some point come back onto standard monitoring, if that's not what you're on, that will be the date that's used for the annual assessment that will be performed. So you'll still retain that profile date, the expiry date, and the reassessment dates that you have in there. So FAQs and things that we've had coming through from some of the previous sessions that we've done on these. One common one we get is how will multi-sector customers be evaluated within there. The evaluation form is designed, hopefully, so that it can be used across multiple sectors. There are some occasional sector-specific questions, but they are the exception rather than the norm. But the idea being that the form can be used as long as the way that the organisation is managed is pretty homogeneous throughout the organisation. If we do, however, see something where maybe the construction testing aspect is managed very, very differently from, say, the asbestos testing part of an organisation, if those were the two things that they did, it is possible to do the evaluation separately and maybe have a different approach for the asbestos team than you would have from the construction testing team in there. So that is a possibility where customers have multiple sectors, but ideally we'd want to be able to treat them all the same within there. How accurate will the responses need to be? As I've already mentioned within there, the matrix is designed to have a sort of level of tolerance to deal with estimates within it. Generally, whether people come out at certain ends of the risk indicator are about whether they've got lots of things going in one direction or the other. So your responses where you're kind of asked for a percentage of work or things like that do not need to be terribly accurate. It's sort of to the nearest 5% in there, really. What if you want to query the outcome? Obviously, if you have an outcome which you're unclear about, your first route for that would be to talk to your assessment manager and your assessment team. They should be able to explain to you why you've got the outcome that you have, what it is that's causing those issues, and hopefully agree with you, how we go about improving that in the future. If you are though not satisfied with that, obviously you can raise that into UCAS further, escalate it as a complaint. What that will happen during this pilot period is, in the first instance, the project team will look at that within there, because it's possible that the reason you're not happy with the outcome is because there's a problem with the evaluation matrix on there, and we need to use that to update and change that. Maybe a situation has come about that we didn't conceive when we were developing the evaluation matrix. But other than that, the complaint would take its normal process, being looked at someone independent within the organisation, normally someone more senior within the team that manages your accreditation. Will this result in any additional cost for the organisations? Generally, no. Standard monitoring will remain as it is at the moment. Obviously, reduced monitoring could result in some reduced costs in there for an organisation. Enhanced monitoring could result in additional costs for the additional assessment that's being performed. But as I've mentioned, that is akin to the extra assessment process that we do at the moment. So it would be no additional cost to what you would have probably got if you'd been in that situation when our assessment had been done anyway. within there. So actually performing the risk evaluation is part of the planning and conduct of the assessment, so is at no additional cost within there. Why are we only sharing some of the details of the outcome? Just to reiterate, I've covered that during the presentation, but just to say again on there, this is to prevent the potential gaming of the system within there, of people looking to sort of focus their details and responses on the things that we're looking at, because we know that we can't measure every possible indicator within there. And also, the indicators don't cover every area of the standard and expectations around how an accredited organisation will perform. So we don't want accredited organisations just focusing on the things that are in the risk evaluation matrix. In terms of the next steps, what's going to come out from here? So within about a week or so, you will receive terms of reference and information packs along with a recording of this webinar for yourself. A few months into this, the project team will start reviewing and analysing the initial data that's coming back, looking to make improvements and tweaks to the evaluation matrix that we're using at the moment. We'll also schedule in some customer feedback sessions. It's probably going to be quite a few months into the pilot there to sort of gather any feedback from customers that have gone through this evaluation process, anything you want to kind of bring back to us about how we should be looking at it and how we should be looking to improve upon them. So that brings us to an end of the presentation. And now I'll go into Q&A. I'll just take a second to grab a drink, and I'll hand over to Yasmin, who's going to be putting your questions to me.
Hi, Jeff. So just whilst we wait for a couple of questions to drift in, one of the common ones that have come up in the past have been about extensions of scopes and how those would be processed.
Okay, so this really doesn't affect the extension to scope process at all. So extensions to scope will still be processed in exactly the same way that they are at the moment, and will be assessed when you as a customer want them to be assessed, whether that's with your routine assessment or as a separate activity within there. The only kind of proviso to add on to that is obviously if the extension to scope was very, very significant. Let's say you currently do construction testing and you decide to expand into becoming a medical testing facility under accreditation as well, then that would probably need us to relook at the risk evaluation because you're taking on such a significant area of work. But for the majority of extensions scopes that we deal with, which is generally adding on new methods, changing new methods within existing accredited activities, this should have no impact upon the extension to scope process.
Okay, great. So we have a question here that's just come up, and it is particularly to do with witnessed assessments. And the question is, would it be possible for UCAS to have flexible dates that are available to assessors at shorter notice, potentially 2 to 3 weeks, if it's not possible to arrange assessment dates months in advance?
Okay, I think this is possibly looking more into sort of a bit of a standard operational practice. I know there's challenges in several sectors in sort of looking at tying up resources to conduct work that is not normally confirmed until very short notice on there. I suggest this might be a question for Sam to take up with the person individually. It's come through as an anonymous question, so if that person is happy to drop their name and their company into the Q&A, we can make sure that Sam or one of his team follow that back up with you.
Just whilst we wait for a few more questions to come through, we've also been asked in the past about whether the risk-based evaluation will affect the date of their next assessments and then the lead times involved. So
yes, so I think definitely can affect the dates of the next assessments. If you're on standard monitoring, it wouldn't affect the date of the next assessment. But if you're on reduced monitoring, then the next assessment may be 16 months from the current date, or it may be 24 months from the current date. Obviously, if your next assessment that is due is your reassessment, then that would still need to be done at the time that is set in there to make sure that your accreditation doesn't expire before we can renew it in there. If you get onto enhanced monitoring, whilst your kind of next full assessment will be an annual activity, you would have some interim assessments, possibly a sort of 6 to 3 month frequency, depending upon how high up the risk scale that you are. But those would not be full assessments. They would be focused on the areas of concern identified through the risk evaluation and the assessment that was just conducted.
Okay. Question about how companies will be chosen for the pilot.
Okay, so we've chosen the organisations that we accredit based upon the sector that they're in. So we started out with the asbestos sector and the medical laboratory sector. Now, we had to put the medical laboratories pilot on hold. The section's under a lot of strain at the moment with all the COVID-19 testing. So we put that one on hold at the moment. But we have gone ahead with the asbestos sector, and we will be going ahead with the construction sector. So it will be that all organisations in the construction testing sector are included within this. Now, in the terms of reference, there are some details about how you can opt out if you want to. I would strongly encourage everyone to stay in. You know, the more organisations we have taking part in this, the better data we get, the more this process will be sort of bedded in and tested for the future within there. So I want to make sure we have a good range of organisations within there. But if you do have some reasons why you want to opt out, those details for that are in the terms of reference.
And will the approach be rolled out to all areas that UCAS accredit in future? In future,
that is the plan, yes. So we are starting with a few sectors. So in addition to construction, we are looking at about another 3 technical sectors that we are looking at to start this pilot on, probably in early 2022 as well. So the idea will be that over the coming years, this is rolled out across all areas of UCAS's business.
Great. As a customer, do I need to supply any additional information for UCAS to complete the risk evaluations?
None of the information that we're asking for is something that you wouldn't have been asked for before in an assessment. You might be asked for it in a slightly different way than we've asked for it before. But things like, you know, looking at staff turnover, perhaps looking about whether you've got a lot of temporary resources and things like that, are all things that we would have considered previously in an assessment, but we may not have perhaps asked for it in such a structured way. It's likely that we will be introducing an annual assessment declaration that goes out to all of our customers. This has been quite routine in a number of areas of UCAS business. I don't know if it's been routine in construction testing though. And in there, you sort of asked a number of these kind of questions, so that the information that you provide in those, if you have filled them out before, that will filter through into this risk evaluation.
Question just come through from the audience about when multi-site locations under a single accreditation. Would the level of assessment be consistent over the company, or would there be the possibility of some locations on standard assessment and others are kind of assessed at different levels or at different?
It is possible. I think I'd come back to what I sort of mentioned for sort of multi-sector customers. If all the locations are managed pretty similarly in there, then we would consider that as a whole and risk evaluate the organisation as a whole, and then that frequency would affect sort of all the locations of that organisation. If, however, you know, one particular site is managed and run much better, or perhaps much worse than the rest of the organisation, then we could consider that separately. And to be honest, we do that a bit at the moment. You know, where an organisation has multiple sectors, you know, multiple locations, where we are perhaps concerned about a certain location, we will look at that more frequently than we will do the other locations they have.
Question again from the audience about when the risk evaluations will start to be completed.
Okay, so we will be starting these from the start of August, and that will be for new assessments being conducted from the start of August. I think sort of seeing the question there, there's kind of a question, if you're partway through an assessment, will this come in? No, I think if we're already kind of underway with the assessment activity at the start of August, then this won't come in until your next year's assessment on there. And that is because, as I mentioned earlier, the kind of work to do this starts in the planning process and then moves through into the conduct of the assessment. So we really need to do it for those assessments that haven't begun yet.
Okay. Will UCAS be sharing the information or the outcomes of evaluations with any third parties?
Not with any third parties within there. Obviously, we'll be sharing the outcomes with the organisations within there. We will be talking them through the sort of areas that have elevated their risk, if that's the outcome on there. We may share sort of aggregated information with stakeholder groups. So if there was kind of a want to look at what the risk profile overall of the sector looks like from a, maybe a regulator or a stakeholder that has a legitimate reason to want to know that, we may share what the overall risk profile looks like, but not what the outcomes of individual organisations are.
Just give it a few more minutes and see if anyone else has some questions.
I think probably it's worth sort of saying at this point, just to give people some idea of what's happened with the asbestos sector as a whole. So one of the things we've been doing with that is sort of asking the teams to consider whether they agree with the outcome from the risk evaluation. And we've got a greater than 90% agreement in those cases. And generally where there's a little bit of disagreement, that has been a customer that kind of falls on the line between one of two categories in there. So it does seem that the matrix is giving a good consistent outcome to what we would expect within there. We've also so far from the customers that have been through this in the asbestos sector, we've not had any queries or anything coming back on this either. So hopefully that's sort of some good signs, and hopefully we'll see the same things happening within the construction testing sector.
We've also not had any opt-outs from the asbestos sector.
Yeah, that's a good point to make as well.
Okay. If the pilot identifies areas of concerns, will the process be reviewed to assess whether they are kind of widespread issues across the sector?
Yes, that is kind of part of one of the outcomes that we would expect over time by sort of having this information and having it done in a more structured way. If we were identifying that there's a common issue coming up in all of the customers within a particular sector, then that then becomes a sector-wide issue that we can look at addressing in a different way. But we would need to have all that kind of sectoral information back, a reasonable percentage of it to do that. So it'd be something that'd be looked at more sort of on an annual basis rather than looking at it regularly within there.
Question just come through about, will we be assessing the individual labs as part of the risk-based approach?
Sorry, I'm just looking at the question on there. That's why I'm not answering it there. I'm not sure I quite understand the question that's being asked in there. I mean, the risk-based approach will be being used for all types of customers that we have, laboratories, inspection bodies, certification bodies. In time, it will come out across the full spectrum of the organisations that we accredit in there. If the question is about whether we will be assessing the organisation's own risk-based approach, because most of the standards that have been revised recently do now have these kind of expectations for organisations to consider risk and opportunity as part of their management of the organisation, then yes, that should be something we're covering as part of the assessment to the standard.
I don't see any other questions coming through.
Okay. If that's the case, then I think it just leaves for me to thank everybody for their time this morning, and thank you for your questions. recording of this session will, as I say, be available in about a week's time, along with terms of reference and an information pack about the project. Within there as well will be some email addresses to, should you have any queries about the project, to get in touch on there. But thank you again for your time, and I hope this goes well, and maybe hopefully get your feedback a few months into the project as well.